Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. And today we have the second episode, that is the middle episode of our three-part mini-series on what is arguably C.S. Lewis's most important book, but it's also one of the trickier ones. My name's Mike Pierce.
And my name is Coel Campo, and yes, we're very excited to get into C.S. Lewis here. As we talked about last week, he is one of the greats and one of our favorites. But last week, we spent pretty much the whole episode fixing C.S. Lewis in time and place, and the same for this book of his, The Abolition of Man. So now we get to consider what Lewis was actually saying, which is a lot harder than it sounds.
Right, because it is one of his most difficult books. And I remember being thankful the first time I read it that it's only 60 pages long. So our task here is to explain as simply as possible, because certainly I would contend, and I think a lot of people would, that this book matters more than pretty much anything else he wrote. And he wrote a lot of very significant stuff.
Right.
So our opening section here, we can say it's about the Green Book, so-called, for boys and girls in the upper forms of schools. And Lewis condemns this book for teaching gimcrack philosophy under the guise of what is supposed to be English literary criticism.
Well, I mean, a fair chunk of the first chapter is Lewis complaining about a school textbook that he's been sent for free as a dreadful influence on the young.
Yeah, and he's not complaining about sex and violence because there isn't any.
Right, but as we saw last week, some guy called Mickelson was making fun of him for being profoundly unexciting. He thought that it was no wonder that it took several decades for the book to really take off in public estimation.
I give not a fig for the opinion of someone like Mickelson who writes continue on. But yes.
Well, it's a good job you're not impossible then. Remind us briefly of why Lewis makes this school book his starting point.
Right. Well, he talks at first about something that the Green Book, as he calls it, he says he will not give us the name of the book or its authors because he owes them good language, as he says, for having sent him a free copy. An anecdote that they talk about, and it's where Coleridge and a visitor are looking at a waterfall, and the visitor calls the waterfall simply pretty, and Coleridge scornfully rejects this in favour of sublime. Now, the authors of the Green Book, teaching their school pupils, say this confusion is constantly present in language as we know it. We appear to be saying something important about something, sublime, but in fact we're simply talking about our own feelings. And Lewis thinks this is an absolutely terrible lesson to teach young children. He subscribes to what he calls the doctrine of objective value, that certain things can merit our approval or our disapproval. So he uses this as the launch pad for this much more philosophical discussion about values.
Which is still extremely relevant, because I would say that a lot of people making such statements are, even today, making statements based on their emotions and not something else.
Right. And we are completely divided over what are values. We are much less concerned these days, at least in the political realm, in fighting one another about economic policy and stuff like that. Very much is about values. Yeah. Okay, so this is where the book starts. Now, just a reminder that The Abolition of Man was first given as 3 lectures in Newcastle in February 1943, and it was published as a book some months later.
And this book looks to me like a wartime shortage of everything, cheapo production.
It certainly does, doesn't it? Yes. So there are still things that are not absolutely essential to the war effort itself being made, but everything's done on the basis of shortage. And I think that's what's happened here. Now, staying with the theme of this first chapter, Lewis contends that human beings are a hybrid. He says that by his intellect, man is mere spirit, and by his appetite, mere animal.
So this is the men without chests idea.
Yes, that what connects our spiritual nature or our intellectual nature with our physical animal body is what he calls chess, and by that he means morality. And that if we don't have a given morality, a common received morality to navigate between our thoughts and ideas, spiritual nature on the one hand, and our physical instincts and appetites on the other, then we are going to be lost souls indeed. And that all previous humanity has seen this as a matter of course, and that it is modern man that's straying away from this on the grounds of the kind of cheap rationalism that we see, this sort of breezy way of talking from the authors of the Green Book, who want to insist that all expressions of value are simply talking about the feelings of the speaker and are nothing to do with the physical object itself. And he says this is a huge mistake. All right, well, let's look at what he has to say about this doctrine of objective value. Until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part, sublime in respect of the waterfall, for example, could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. St. Augustine, Aristotle, Plato thought that the aim of education was to train the child to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. In early Hinduism, that conduct in men which can be called good consists in conformity to the ritar, that great ritual or pattern of nature and supernature, which is revealed in the cosmic order, the moral virtues, and the ceremonial of the temple.
So he's casting his net wide here. He's invoking the idea that morality is universal.
Yes, that's his central plank, that the different traditional moral codes of humanity overlap far more than they differ from one another. Okay, so he casts his net wider still. The Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing, called the Tao. It's the way in which the universe goes on. It's also the way which every man should tread, conforming all activities to that great exemplar. This conception in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to for brevity simply as the Tao.
So, to reiterate a point we made last week, he's not an adherent of the Chinese religion of Taoism. He's simply using the term in the sense that he's describing.
Yes, that's right. He's staying studiedly neutral in his commitment to one particular traditional school of thought rather than another, because his central point is they all converge on the stuff that he, Lewis, is talking about. Yeah. What's common to them all is something we cannot neglect. It's the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others are really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are.
Now, Are you okay with objective value? I mean, I know you get a stomach ache with the way that some Christians talk about objective truth, etc. And of course, I'm looking out for your general health here.
Yeah, of course you are, yes, as always. Well, yes, I think I am okay in the terms that he's talking about it. I do think that certain kinds of Christians throw around the word objective and indeed absolute far too freely. That in doing so, they are actually buying into a modernist mindset that pre-moderns didn't talk this kind of way. And they're leaving themselves wide open to the rather obvious postmodern objections to it. But I think what Lewis is saying here is a lot more careful than that when he talks about the doctrine of objective value. He kind of qualifies it towards the end of that sentence here, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. That qualifies or explains what he means. So he says, those who know the Tao can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions at the moment, but to recognize a quality, and here comes a crucial phrase, I think, which demands a certain response from us, whether we make it or not.
I'm no world-renowned historian who's written several books, but I I would wager a guess that I would wager a guess that several pre-modern religions that he's kind of bringing up here, although they're all distinct and different in their own ways, I would imagine that they have a lot of similar values.
Yes, yes, he's saying that they're all kind of converging on the same kind of moral codes. Now, of course, it's easy for someone to come along and point out big differences between them.
Right.
You're not going to find something horrible like sooty widow burning in Christianity, for example, right? So you can certainly point out these differences, but the general instincts which drive them along are overlapping in all of them, even if different cultures are outliers concerning certain features. And really, it is that huge area of overlap that is his point. In fact, I said that the book is 60 pages long. There's a few pages at the end given over to statements from the various different global cultures on ethical and moral matters, showing how they parallel one another, track one another very closely, which again is the central point of his book.
Right. So he's saying that there's this higher morality that runs through all of them. But what about this last part of the sentence about demanding a certain response from us? What exactly does he have in mind there?
Well, that is central to his idea of what he's calling the doctrine of objective value, that we are supposed to find children delightful, or old men venerable, or the waterfall sublime, and that they have these qualities, as it were, intrinsically, and therefore they demand that kind of response from us, even if we don't make it.
Mm.
I mean, in a sense, this is kind of commonsensical because we can say, let's all agree on something like, you shall not steal. And yet we all know that people steal.
Right.
But nevertheless, that doesn't invalidate the moral precept. Right. So he's taking it much further than this and saying these values adhere to certain objects, regardless of whether or not this person or that person is actually playing along with them. That's all he's saying there, yes.
Okay.
Okay, now this kind of argument will have bumped up quite harshly with certain kinds of religious instincts in the mid 20th century. We've already seen in, our last three series really, one on apologetics, one on the crisis of the Catholic Church, one on the crisis of evangelicalism, how difficult religious people found it to come to terms with modernity. And one of the responses that many people were making at the time Lewis was writing, and indeed for a while afterwards, was very different to what he was saying. So one of the many rationalist critiques of religious teachings was that they borrowed from one another. The Ten Commandments echoed teachings of still older religious traditions, etc. And Christians often reacted against this by metaphorically stamping their little feet and trying to prove that, on the contrary, biblical precepts were unique in every respect. Now, as we can see, Lewis has got nothing to do with that kind of defense. He's very relaxed in the face of this challenge. So he's paddling in the opposite direction and saying, no, they do overlap, and that's absolutely fine, for reasons that we will explore some next week, actually.
Right. I'll never forget one of my first college classes was world religions. And, being raised in a Christian home and you're exposed to all of these other pre modern religions for the first time. And specifically, Zoroastrianism gave me such a turn inside out because I thought this sounds exactly like somebody put a different label on Christianity. And I was so upset to think that Christianity was just another label for, something that somebody else had already thought of. Exactly.
Well, yes, maybe in some moral aspects it's highly dualistic, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
In a way that some Christian heretics have been. And it doesn't posit a saviour or radical forgiveness or anything like that, I think.
Right.
But yeah, I can see there will be some areas of overlap, although the overlap is much greater with certain kinds of Christian heresies than with Christianity itself, I think. But yeah, I can see how looking at these kind of things, these different religions, will give some people from perhaps quite protected backgrounds a bit of a scare. But maybe, maybe they needed that scare.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so he wants to concede at once that morality might be subject to development from within. He already used the expression the person who knows the Tao, who's under the Tao, right? But not to surgery from without. That is, if you have allowed yourself and your thought world and your whole life to be shaped by the Tao, traditional morality, then when you come to a point where there is an extremely difficult moral situation and where some nasty choices need to be made, then you are the kind of person who will know what sort of direction to pursue, which commands might take priority, and so on. But if you've never done that, and you are, as it were, like a clinician in a white lab coat standing outside hacking it about, you can't really say anything to the purpose because you don't know, you've never placed yourself under the authority of traditional wisdom, traditional morality, to be able to say what is more important or less important in that difficult circumstance. So he's not denying that everything is highly complex. He's saying that nothing is that straightforward. He's conceding that point immediately.
Right. He's saying that you have to acknowledge the authority of traditional morality before you can start tweaking things or discussing moral dilemmas.
Right, yes. Okay, so let's dive into the Tao a little further here.
So here he's just been speaking about the idea that a soldier ought, or perhaps ought not, to be ready to sacrifice himself in battle.
Yes, and considering the different arguments that get made for that point one way or another. And he's saying a refusal to sacrifice oneself. Remember, this is all being written against the background of World War II. This is in 1943. Is no more rational than a consent to do so, and no less rational. From propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. This will preserve society. In other words, this sacrificing your life in battle will preserve society cannot lead to do this except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. In other words, unless you know in advance the moral value society ought to be preserved, then coming to the point, here is a battle, I have to fight in it, I might be killed, you're unable to draw the conclusion, well, okay, I will do it because society should be preserved. You have to know in advance that value. Conversely, if you want to argue things the other way, this will cost you your life cannot lead directly to do not do this. It can lead to it only through a felt desire or an acknowledged duty of self-preservation. The innovator, the innovator in values, the modernist, the authors of the Green Book, the innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood. And though he continues trying to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing is impossible.
Okay, so imperative and indicative moods, this is the kind of thing that will probably need some careful explanation because most of us aren't as in sure command of our own language as we were in 1943.
This is true, sadly. Okay, so the imperative mood is the form of a verb. Sit down, come here, do this, stop that, shut up, go over there. Those are all examples of the imperative mood of the verbs come, go, stop, and so on, right? Command. And the indicative mood is simply a statement of fact. The cat sat on the mat, right? The jam is in the refrigerator. I am feeling tired. Those are all statements in the indicative mood of the verb, right? And so he's saying that the innovator is trying to get a conclusion, do this, don't do that, some moral command in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood, simply statements of fact. And he, as a grammarian, remember he's teaching English literature, he's saying this is impossible. You can carry on juggling with words as long as you like, it can't be done. You have to know in advance that certain things are good or bad for their own sake. All right, the truth finally becomes apparent that the practical principles behind the modernist innovator's case for posterity, that is, we must act for the good of the human race in the long run, or society, or the species, they are there, but from time immemorial in the Tao. They're nowhere else. Unless you accept these without question as being to the world of action what axioms are to the world of theory, you can have no practical principles whatever. You can't reach them as conclusions. They are premises. In other words, they are the back wall. There's nothing behind them. That's it. That's the back. But then you must allow that reason can be practical, that an ought must not be dismissed because it cannot produce some is as its credential. If nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. Similarly, if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, nothing's obligatory at all.
So he's saying that in order to have present morality, you have to have your back up against something. You have to have some idea of where this is coming from before you can make claims like you should sacrifice yourself for the better of society.
You need to know in advance that society is to be preserved is a moral value.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So, yeah, you need to know that in advance. It's not a statement of fact, it's a value. And what he's saying is that the world of values is connected with the world of physical facts by morality.
The same way that your spirit is connected with your
with your body,
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is the chest.
Yes.
Yeah, this is the chest.
Okay, so at the end here, he's saying an ought must not be dismissed because it can't produce something to its credential. This is the imperative ought and indicative is thing again.
Yes, it's the same. He's restating this point because it's that kind of important to him. It's central to his argument.
Right.
Yeah. Now, as we've already mentioned, this is happening against the backdrop of the crescendo of World War II. And here we have just a reminder of the central kind of little rags of so-called morality used by the Nazis and the communists. So the Nazis, your nation or your ethnos is the supreme value. And the communists, well, no, the future perfect society is all that matters.
So, as you often point out, though, it was the clash between these two which was at the heart of World War II. In Europe, at least, everyone else was just sort of collateral damage.
Yes, it was a clash between the two modernist forms of identity, nation and class. So national consciousness begets nationalism, and after World War One, rather a lot of nationalism had gone into overdrive and become fascism, of which Nazism was the most monstrous form. And class consciousness begets socialism, and that had come out in the most monstrous form of Soviet communism. And the clash between these two titans was the central part, in Europe at least, of World War II, and was certainly where most of the dying happened. We needn't dive out into this now, but I used to make a point of shocking students by comparing body counts between various countries in World War II. We needn't go into that now, it's rather terrible, but it was this clash where most of the dying happened, but by a long, long way, actually. But his point is that our loyalty to our country or our ethnos is indeed a value, but it's there in the Tao. And indeed, our longing for people to have some kind of equality and to create a perfect or at least a happier society for the future is also extremely important because it has its roots in traditional morality. But what both of these horrible, horrible ideologies were doing was wresting some shred from the Tao and using it to destroy everything else and considering it justification for massacring anybody and everybody who stood in their way and trampling upon all ideas of justice, good faith, and everything else. And in a way, that was his point. So he doesn't spend a lot of time on politics, but it's implicit in what he is saying that his book can be, and I think should be read, as an assault on the modernist ideologies of his day. And he's saying that the Green Book, whilst the authors are not necessarily fascists or communists, this is the direction in which this whole kind of thought leads in the end.
Because it seems very innocent when you're talking about it in a grammar book.
Right, yes.
Right. But when it gets blown out of proportion, it looks more like Nazism and communism.
Well, I think he would go further than saying it's being blown out of proportion, that it inevitably sets the mind off in this kind of direction.
Right.
That it's making pragmatism a supreme virtue for no reason that it can give for itself. So he says the innovator attacks traditional values, the Tao, in defense of what he at first supposes to be rational or biological values.
So the modernist innovator likes to argue that morality is just a rationalization of collective self-interest.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty much what he means by rational or biological. But as we've seen, all the values which he uses in attacking the Tao and even claims to be substituting for it are themselves derived from the Tao. And think of the point that we made just a moment ago about nationalism and communism. If he'd really started from scratch, from right outside the human tradition of value, no jugglery could have advanced him an inch towards the conception that a man should die for the community or work for posterity. If the Tao falls, all his own conceptions of value fall with it. Not one of them can claim any authority other than that of the Tao. Only by such shreds of the Tao as he's inherited is he enabled even to attack it. And he clearly has in mind, loyalty to my tribe or equality of the peoples. The question therefore arises what title he has to select bits of it for acceptance and to reject others. For if the bits he rejects have no authority, neither have those he retains. Conversely, if what he retains is valid, what he rejects is equally valid too. So this is a repudiation really of ideology. Ideology is basically a neat set of 3 or 4 ideas that fit together and are held to explain everything and that must be used to hammer down everything else which is apparently just so much mumbo jumbo. Right? And that's what he's rejecting. He's saying, no, what we've got is a whole load of ways of valuing different things, different people, moral commands, and yes, they will bump into one another, but they are all important, and we need to navigate our way through all of them. You can't just snatch on one of them to batter down everything else. Otherwise, you will have the horrible results that, in fact, particularly in 1943, you were having. Okay, so towards the end of the book, in the 3rd and final chapter, he talks about the idea of the conquest of nature, which he considers to be an illusion.
Yes, so we don't often hear this sort of expression these days, but I gather one probably did pretty often back when you were alive.
Yes. Well, certainly in the 1940s, but for a generation or so afterwards. So that would certainly include me. But yeah, we don't hear this anymore. Nobody talks in these terms, the conquest of nature. In fact, if you listen to not just rabid environmentalists, but loads of people who've at least been somewhat affected by that, which is pretty much all of us, most of us would say that we've conquered nature far too much, right? And that we're now in a lot of trouble as a result. But back then, when science appeared to be on the march and human lifespans were still lengthening rather than being destroyed by terrible plastic food and all that kind of thing, then the conquest of nature was still very much a buzz phrase. That's right, yes. But he's saying that this is an illusion. He wants to argue that man's power over nature is actually a power exercised by some men over other men using nature as their instrument. Let's consider 3 typical examples: the aeroplane, the wireless, and the contraceptive. In a civilized community in peacetime, anyone who can pay for them may use these things. But it cannot strictly be said that when he does so, he's exercising his own proper or individual power over nature. If I pay you to carry me, I'm not therefore myself a strongman. Any or all of the 3 things I've mentioned can be withheld from some men by other men, by those who sell, or those who allow the sale, or those who own the sources of production, or those who make the goods.
So Lewis is going in for a bit of debunking of his own here.
Yes, he is. He's turning the whole thing around and saying, do we say this in America? What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander? Is that an expression?
I don't think
No,
so.
maybe not. Or maybe it is, but it's just so out of date. Sometimes I would say something in classroom, and the students would look at me and say, "Is this another Briticism again, Dr. Pierce?" And then I would talk to a colleague or a friend afterwards and say, "We don't say this in America," and they would tell me, "Yes, we do. It's just, they're all 19."
Well, that may be the problem here.
So, yeah, that may be the problem. I don't know. Doubtless we'll get feedback on this.
Yes.
Okay. What we call man's power is, in reality, a power possessed by some men, which they may or may not allow other men to profit by. Again, as regards the powers manifested in the aeroplane or the wireless, man is as much the patient or subject as the possessor, since he's the target both for bombs and for propaganda. Again, another sideways reference to World War II. And as regards contraceptives, there's a paradoxical negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. By contraception, simply, they're denied existence. By contraception used as a means of selective breeding, they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer. So, what he's saying here is that future humanity can be cut out in the shape preferred by some earlier generation. From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument.
He's starting to sound kind of scary.
Yeah, he intends to. That, I think, is really what he's going for here.
Right.
Okay, well, this statement from Frank Herbert tends strongly in the same direction. Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. Now, Lewis, of course, is warning precisely of this. And what might have seemed a distant, fuzzy sort of peril in 1943 is now, with the advent of AI and the world order being upended by tech billionaires, more or less upon us.
Sort of a scary, sobering thought.
Well, yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah. We are not really in control of our lives. In one sense, we are, and YouTube videos are one manifestation of that, right? But on the one hand, any of us might lose access to these things through some technical glitch or somebody deciding somewhere that they don't want you to see them. And the same goes for our ability to make these things, right? And we have no power over them at all. The power is wielded by a very few people.
Again, as a renowned historian, maybe you can provide some insight into this, but I sort of see this as similar to like the advent of gun warfare because I feel like that really changed the balance of power in the world.
Yes, it did. But the thing about guns is that they aren't as all encompassing. You know, if you can make some guns and some people might have them, and then other people can make them and they can spread or be improved upon. But basically, if you've got a worldwide internet, the control globally is in the hands of very few people. And almost none of us, only a tiny number of us, are in a position to counteract that in any sense whatsoever.
Right.
And this is apparently progress. And the thing is, it doesn't even really give us the possibility of opting out of it. Right? That's the problem.
Right.
Right? Try living in a Western country today, or even anywhere, but certainly in a Western country, without using computers or the internet. Good luck.
Yeah, this is like some countries, I guess, considering access to internet as being a human right now.
Yes, let's not go back into that one. But if anyone wants to know what human rights are or what they are not, they might look at the relevant discussion in our series, I suppose.
Right.
Okay, well, let's come to the conclusion that Lewis drives this to, that conquering nature, in quotation marks, is abolishing humanity if we're not very careful. When we understand a thing analytically, it could be any object, say a tree or a bird, and then dominate and use it for our own convenience, we reduce it to the level of nature in the sense that we suspend our judgments of value about it, ignore its final cause, if any, and treat it in terms of quantity. This repression of our total reaction to a thing is sometimes very noticeable and even painful. Something has to be overcome before we can cut up a dead man or a live animal in a dissecting room. These objects resist the movement of the mind whereby we thrust them into the world of mere nature. But the great minds know very well that the object so treated is an artificial abstraction, that something of its reality has been lost.
Well, we still treat the bodies of the dead with a lot of reverence as not a mere physical object, but yet we have the dissecting room.
Right, right. So we haven't quite yet got to the final point in respect of dead human beings, right? Although, of course, really horrible, callous people in a war situation who just massacred a whole lot of people are likely to treat the bodies as simply so much refuse that needs clearing up and throwing away in bin bags or something like that. But nevertheless, in general, that is not the case. But nothing in our overall philosophy of the world, highly materialist, highly pragmatic, suppressing ideas about value of physical objects like human bodies. Nothing really stands in our way from doing that. Maybe the corpse of a loved one is the last redoubt of something that previous generations of people extended to the whole of the physical world around them. From this point of view, the conquest of nature appears in a new light. We reduce things to mere nature in order that we may, quote, conquer them. We're always conquering nature because nature is the name for what we have to some extent conquered. The price of conquest is to treat a thing as mere nature. Every conquest over nature increases her domain. The stars don't become nature till we can weigh and measure them. Right? Think of the way in which people in the past consider them to be something like celestial beings. The soul does not become nature till we can psychoanalyze her. And remember, in the 1940s, people were still in thrall to the new popularity of the theories of Freud, which are generally disbelieved in now, but they would be in the 1940s, 50s, and probably into the early 1980s or so. The wresting of powers from nature is also the surrendering of things to nature. As long as this process stops short of the final stage, we may well hold that the gain outweighs the loss. But as soon as we take the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, the whole process is stultified. For this time, the being who stood to gain and the being who has been sacrificed are one and the same. This is one of the many instances where to carry a principle to what seems its logical conclusion produces absurdity.
So the reason he's bringing in nature here is that line there where he says we can't reduce humankind just to another product of nature.
Right. Well, he really thinks this about nature as a whole, but he's coming down to humanity because he's saying, well, okay, all the other so called conquests of nature, you might say that the plus side of the register is more than the negative side of the register. All right. But once we subject ourselves and our own bodies, people, to this treatment, then we undo all the products from the journey so far. We're taking the thing to its absurd conclusion.
So is this going back to, again, the connection that he's making between spirit and body? He's already sort of made his point that the spiritual side of us is important, and now he's making a point that the physical side of humanity is also important.
Right, but he's saying that you can't treat people as though they are mere things.
Right.
But that is the tendency of our whole direction of thought. To take one example, if your sole purpose in life is to increase the sales of the product of your company, you no longer think of people quite as people, but as customers, and their disinclination to buy your product as sales resistance. And by talking that way, you're ignoring the fact that you're dealing with whole people and you're dealing with them entirely functionally in terms of the needs of you and your company.
Yeah.
Right? And you could say, you could make the same kind of consideration or discussion for loads and loads of spheres of modernist activity, that we're losing sight of the wholeness of the person, just as we did of the trees or of the animals or of the natural environment generally.
Right.
There are progressions in which to go the whole way is to undo all the labour of your previous journey. To reduce the Tao to a mere natural product. Now, what's he saying there? He's saying that if you want to insist that traditional morality is simply an expression of collective self interest, or perhaps individual or sectional self interest, and therefore you're debunking it. He's saying to reduce the Tao to a mere natural product is a step of that kind. Up to that point, the kind of explanation which explains things away may give us something, though at a heavy cost. But you cannot go on explaining away forever. You'll find that you've explained explanation itself away.
Now, isn't this expression sort of a mere juggling with words, though? What does he really mean?
Well, I think he means it quite literally, actually, because explaining something is a value. Human beings value explanation because they value knowledge. But if you actually get rid of all those traditional values, why bother? What is there to explain? Just do what you want on the basis of your animal appetites or something like that. No need to explain.
Right.
You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It's good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. And here, hold on to your hats, everybody. How if you saw through the garden too? It's no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see.
Whew. That leaves you with a really ghostly sort of atmosphere, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, it does. And that's the conclusion of his book.
Oof.
Okay, so in summary, only the Tao, the common stock of traditional morality and wisdom, provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny or an obedience which is not slavery.
But yet, traditional morality has been held up by all societies before recent times, most of which were very far from free, and some of which actually had slavery.
Oh, he's not saying that traditional morality is a sufficient condition for a free society, only that it is a necessary condition, that traditional morality makes freedom at least possible. It won't necessarily drive you there. Well, I think he thinks it probably will in the longer run. Maybe not necessarily, but at least it makes it possible. We need to remind ourselves he's not idealizing the past. He's battling against contemporary evils. And the debunking of traditional morality had already led to that most modern of evils, totalitarianism, by precisely the process that he puts his finger upon, upholding one value or maybe two values at the expense of everything else, and driving justice, the sanctity of human life, and everything completely out of the window. Okay, well, one book that I think some people might enjoy, although warning, it's intellectually demanding, so it isn't necessarily going to be for everybody, is Michael Ward's 2021 book, After Humanity. And it gives an analysis to the Abolition of Man. It calls itself a guide to that book.
Now, Michael Ward is a Catholic priest writing about an Anglican thinker while he is professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. I mean, that's impressive.
Yes, and it's certainly a significant example of the way in which, particularly in America, but also a lot in Britain as well, and one or two other countries, in recent years, Catholics and evangelicals have been living in one another's pockets. The old animosities are, except for a few distasteful diehards on either side, they are definitely disappearing rapidly into the rearview mirror. And good riddance, I say. Okay, well, to finish then, the abolition of man achieves two things. One, it demolishes the idea that we can invent new moral systems. There is the Tao, traditional morality, or there is nothing. And secondly, it defends that morality without once invoking God.
Yes, God has been left out of this argument completely, and that's particularly noteworthy.
Yes. In fact, there's one sentence in the book which made me draw breath and think that C.S. Lewis too was capable of being extremely naughty when it suited him. He says at one point, "I'm not here attempting an indirect argument for theism." I felt like I wanted to laugh and say, "But that's exactly what you're doing. That's where this whole thing leads." But he's cautious in not making that explicit. And what we want to do next time is pick up on those kind of loose ends and some of the other potentialities that are in this sort of argument, to have a look at where they lead and how this book can still be extremely useful in the present.
You mean you're not going to teach us to argue like C.S. Lewis next time?
Well, it wouldn't be a bad thing, would it?
I wouldn't be disappointed.
No. Well, thank you everybody for staying with us. And as ever, we exhort you to repost this on social media and tell your friends about this channel if you've enjoyed it. And if you hate it, then tell them about it anyway, particularly the people you don't like, and that will serve them right.
Thanks for staying with us, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Bye bye now.